Hi, everyone. Welcome to All on Board Board Basics and Best Practices with NCCADV and NC I am Carrie Ann Fisher. I'm the Executive Director of the North Carolina Coalition Against Domestic Violence.
And I am Deanna Harrington, the Director of Statewide Capacity.
All right. Well, to get started, just to tell you a little bit about NCCADV, we lead the state's movement to end domestic violence and to enhance work with survivors through collaborations, innovative trainings, prevention, technical assistance, state policy development, and legal advocacy. And we do that through four main branches, which is technical assistance, providing answers to questions, guiding people to the right direction for information about best practices, public policy, advocating for changes to laws in the federal government and the state government, training for providers across North Carolina, and then programs that meet unmet needs throughout the state. And now Deanna's going to tell you a little bit more about NC CASA.
Thanks, Carrie Ann. So NC CASA, we are a statewide coalition. We use a social justice framework for everything that we do. So our work is done from a strong intersectional social justice perspective. We believe that by centering our work around marginalized communities, everyone is served. And so some of the ways that we do that and what our work looks like is we organize and sponsor statewide trainings related to sexual violence. We provide support to rape crisis centers through the technical assistance or training, resource sharing and technical assistance, working on legislative agendas and policy change. We do anti-human trafficking outreach, prevention education, and then we also have a college and universities program that we operate.
So quickly, a little bit about our agenda. We're going to do a quick round of introductions. And actually, we'll then also talk a little bit about why boards are important and why organizations have boards. We'll talk a little bit about board roles and responsibilities. We'll discuss best practices and make some suggestions around the ways you can operate. We'll talk about the relationship and the ways in which the Council for Women and Youth Involvement operates, and then we'll wrap things up for the day. So just a few tips and pointers around getting around on Zoom while we're talking. So you can see at the top, there's an arrow that shows how to get into gallery view, which allows you to see everyone who's participating in this training. Down at the bottom of the screen from left to right, there's a button for the mic to turn it on and off, a place to turn the video on and off. So if you don't want your camera on, you're welcome to turn that off. If you want to send us a message without interrupting or because you're having any kind of sound issues, feel free to use the chat button at the bottom. And then lastly, you can give folks a thumbs up or a clap or a celebration if there's something you want to react to that they're sharing. And we will do some breakout groups. You'll see some place where it should pop up on your screen when we go into breakout rooms, but if you don't see that, please let us know. A lot of times it's helpful to sort of hover over it if you don't see an automatic invitation, and then you can click the join link on the right-hand side as it shows in step 2 to join the breakout room to which you've been assigned. And then lastly, please be careful when you're clicking to leave the room to return to the main room. Sometimes there's an option to leave the meeting and that takes you out of the call completely. So please make sure you click on leave breakout room instead of leave meeting so that you can stay with us for the rest of the training. All right, so to get started, in your teams that we're going to send you to, make sure that you identify someone to report back, someone to keep the time, and we're going to spend about 5 minutes. And the discussion questions we want to talk about is, what is something about your board that you're proud of? What is something about your board that you want to improve or that isn't currently working? And then what brought your team to this training today? And please make sure that you also introduce yourself, the organization that you're with, and how long you've been on the board. And if you're not sure, because you're new to the board, in regard to what's something you're proud of, what's something you've heard about the board that you're proud of and why you're proud to serve on that board as a result of that. So we'll take about 5 minutes. We'll send you to some breakout rooms and we'll be back in 5 minutes. All right, welcome back. And Deanna, are we ready for me to switch over? Or am I looking at the wrong thing?
I think you have a couple more slides.
Oh, I am looking at the wrong thing. Okay, it's not, let me move this over. Okay, all right. So then the next piece is about why have a board. So there are 3 main reasons to have a board, which are legal reasons, ethical reasons, and practical reasons. So we're going to talk through each of these. So legal reasons include that the state laws are very explicit. They're very clear about the fact that nonprofit corporations need to have a board to assume the fiduciary role for the organization's well-being. So that includes reviewing regularly the finances of the organization and ensuring the organization is operating ethically and fiscally responsibly. The board exercises corporate powers, including appointing the executive director, and then the board delegates powers to officers, executives, and other staff who act for the organization in its day-to-day operations. The ethical reasons include providing oversight to ensure that the public and all individual stakeholders to be able to assure them that the organization is in good hands. The board assumes responsibility for the achievements or lack thereof within the organization. In other words, the board's duties are ensuring the organization not only does things right, but does the right thing, stays on track with its mission, and is doing the pieces of their work that they have shared with funders that will be part of their work. It's important to remember for the organization the practical reasons. So board service is volunteer service. So it's important for you as a board member to bring your experience and perspective to the table. The organization sought you out as a board member or chose you as a board member because of your experience. So please, by all means, share what you know. A board that is familiar with and representative of the constituency and its needs is better able to steer the organization in a direction that is helpful for those it serves. So if you have lived experience, if your career is helpful to the organization, bring that to the board table and bring that to the organization. So in your teams, let's talk about the reasons why you personally joined the board. What drove you to do it? What led you to accept the invitation? And do you have just one reason, or do you have a mix of reasons on your board? Are most people there for the same category of reasons, or in your group, or are there a lot of different reasons that come up? So we'll take about 5 minutes to talk about it in our teams, in our groups. All right. Welcome back.
So next we're going to talk about board roles and responsibilities. There are 3 duties of the board: duty of care, duty of loyalty, and duty of obedience. Duty of care is to take care of the nonprofit by ensuring prudent use of all assets, including the facility, the people, and the goodwill. There's duty of loyalty, which ensures that the nonprofit's activities and transactions are first and foremost advancing its mission. Recognize and disclose conflicts of interest, make decisions that are in the best interest of the nonprofit, not in the best interest of the individual board member, or any other individual or for-profit entity. And duty of obedience. Ensure that the nonprofit obeys applicable laws and regulations, follows its own bylaws, and the nonprofit adheres to its stated corporate purposes and mission. So let's talk about the legal. As part of the duty of obedience, the board of directors is responsible for the assurance that the organization is in compliance with the laws and regulations, along with contracts, that the agency adheres to contracts around occupational safety, health, labor, and related regulations, and that you also have an established system that encourages ethical and legal activity. You have to have a policy for the organization around this, and you must follow your own requirements for bylaws and articles of incorporation. So how do you do that? There's 3 policies that fall under legal. Your first is financial. So as a board, you work together to accomplish the following financial tasks: review and approve the agency's financial policies, establish and approve the agency's annual budget in conjunction with the staff, review and approve regular financial reports and ask questions for clarification, make investment decisions for agency's assets, establish the audit committee to conduct the agency's independent audit. This should also be in conjunction with your staff. Ensure the agency completes and files its annual tax return, so your 990s, and other required regulatory reports and forms, so charitable trust registrations, business license, etc. Review financial procedures and/or your manual on a periodic basis with staff, and review the regular financial reports and be willing to ask questions on items that you do not understand in the agency's financial or audit reports. All right, the financial policy checklist. The minimum financial areas that need specific policies to ensure internal controls for your agency include segregation of duties, collecting and recording receivables, recording payables, petty cash, cash deposits, receiving cash, bank reconciliations, payroll preparation, authorizing expenses, and check signing. So next, we're going to place you into breakout rooms. You have in the instructions for spend 5 minutes in your teams coming up with questions you would ask to determine the financial health of your agency. All right. Next, we're going to talk a little bit more about the financial health, specifically about how that's connected to sexual assault and domestic violence centers. So we are eligible for multiple funding streams that are provided on a reimbursement basis, meaning you have to spend the money in order to get the money back. It's because of this that it's recommended by funders that an agency have at least 3 to 6 months reserve for each reimbursable grant. Next, let's talk about some financial red flags. These are the red flags that your funders are looking at as they're reviewing and doing desk monitoring of your spending, but also during your in-person site visits. So unaccountable funds, altered, inadequate, or missing documentation, a very low or very high utilization rate, you're behind on submitting cost reports, and you only have one person who is in control of everything that's related to your financials. Next, we're talking about fundraising. The board sets the course for the agency, and it must ensure that the organization has access to enough resources to meet its goals. So you all should be the main fundraising body of the organization. You all should have a committee of your board that is set up for fundraising and sustainability. It may require staff time to support completing fundraising, but you must not rely on staff entirely. For example, the executive director may play a role in your fundraising plan. They can do this as long as you have prepared in your budget that they be paid with non-grant funds so that they can perform this function. Conflict of interest. Every nonprofit should have a conflict of interest policy. The conflict of interest policy typically addresses situations when a board or staff person can gain a financial benefit through an insider connection. For example, the relationship with your agency. Both actual and perceived conflicts of interest should be fully disclosed and or avoided. So some examples of this would include a board member who owns a print shop that wants to print your agency's brochures, or a board member who wants the executive director to hire a family member to work at the agency. The potential conflict of interest is when the board members can use their influence as an insider on the decisions for their personal gain. So more about your conflict of interest policy. The conflict of interest policy should provide guidance on potential conflicts that can be addressed within your agency. Most policies have the following two elements in addressing these: disclosure and exclusion from board discussion and vote. Disclosure requires all board and key staff members to disclose any possible conflicts in terms of affiliations with businesses that the agency may do business with and other boards on which they serve, as well as the exclusion from board discussion and vote. The board member who has the potential conflict should recuse themselves from the discussion and vote. This should also be recorded in the board minutes. Additionally, if a conflict of interest does occur and the board proceeds to do business with a company that a board or key staff member has a financial interest, it is recommended that the agency should be fully aware of any requirements to disclose this conflict to funders to ensure compliance. As best practice, nonprofits should create a conflict of interest form to be completed by all board members and key staff, including your executive director, your finance director or manager, and other management staff on an annual basis. As your agency files its annual federal tax return, or your 990 for nonprofits, the tax form will have questions about whether your agency has this policy in place. IRS 990 forms specifically ask about annual disclosures of conflict of interest from the board of directors and staff. Supervision of the executive director. The board of directors is responsible for hiring the executive director of the agency and supporting and evaluating this position. Supporting the director includes complimenting them on a job well done, giving them constructive feedback, assisting them through tough issues with other board members, keeping them informed on issues about which the board is aware, clarifying expectations that the board has of them, including maintaining an up-to-date job description for them, encouraging the executive director to take care of themselves, including taking leave when necessary, and introducing them to community leaders. A committee of the board, such as the executive committee, they conduct the annual evaluation of the director. The director should know well in advance of the review by what criteria they're being assessed. Some agencies may choose to have staff, volunteers, or community members provide input into the review process as well. It's important that the review be conducted in a confidential, professional manner. The evaluation for the executive director can be similar to the evaluations conducted for other agency staff. Other duties around the executive director. The hiring process, it can also be delegated to a committee of the board, such as a search committee, but the entire board should be kept informed about the hiring process and should be able to give input into the criteria by which potential executives are assessed. Staff and other agency stakeholders should be given input into the search process. When it comes to hiring the chief staff officer of any agency, it is wise for the board to seek input from multiple stakeholders in order to make the best decision for the organization. Determine and uphold mission. Board of Directors is responsible for setting the course for the organization. They should establish the mission for the organization once it's first conceived. and then moving forward should maintain and make sure that the organization is upholding that mission. The board should revisit the mission every 5 years in order to evaluate its relevance to the field in light of any trends or issues that the agency is facing. In setting the organization's purpose, the board determines the reasons for which the agency exists. The board should determine the agency's programs and goals based on the mission of the organization. The board is responsible for ensuring the organization stays true to its mission, so your duty of loyalty. As the board sets the mission and purposes for the organization, it should also be engaged in a planning process to determine what specific goals the agency should seek to accomplish in order to pursue its mission. In other words, the energy of the organization must be used to accomplish the organization's mission. Planning can happen many different ways, but it's important that every agency engage in a planning process. The board may choose to bring an outside facilitator to guide the agency in its planning. It's possible for the board to engage in a planning process without outside assistance, but the board may wish to examine any of the number of materials that have been published regarding the strategic planning before beginning to plan. Planning for the future. The board is responsible for evaluating the effectiveness of the organization's programs and service. The board, in conjunction with the staff, should determine when programs and services should be changed. Programs exist in ever-changing environments. In order to change to meet the evolving needs of clients, the board must assess any trends that would alter the needs of or fundamentally change the client base. Board should then use this information in the organization's planning processes to adapt programs to meet the new and emerging needs. Organizations may need to alter their programs even if they are not new trends in the field. Advancing the organization's public image. Board members are the organization's main representatives out in the community. In order to promote the organization, board members should be able to speak about the mission, goals, and programs of the agency. Board members should take opportunities to promote the organization to civic, religious, community, and government groups as appropriate. The board and executive director should determine who serves as the official spokesperson for the agency, but all board members should be able to speak intelligently about the organization on a more casual basis. Meaning, do you have your elevator speech for your organization? Because board and staff cannot speak to every constituent or community member, organizations should publish an annual report that details programmatic accomplishments and financial data. By publishing such a document, the organization informs the public about its mission and successes and generates more interest in the agency as a whole. Please take a moment to place your elevator speech in the chat. Strengthen your board's effectiveness. Boards grow and change throughout the life of an organization. In order to best meet the changing demands facing them, the board should develop a new member orientation that prepares newcomers for their roles, educate themselves continuously, assess board performance, identify and recruit new members, and develop committees as appropriate. A committee of the board, such as the nominating committee, may complete some of these tasks. All board members should identify their own needs for ongoing education and be responsible for seeking out resources that will assist them in their jobs. In every nonprofit organization, the board of directors works to establish policy, develop organizational vision, and plan for the organization's future. In order to achieve and maintain a healthy organization, boards themselves must be healthy. Boards, like agencies, go through life cycles in which the level of support they require varies. It's important to understand the different changes boards experience and to understand that the needs of the board vary over time. Most importantly, it's crucial that managers of organizations understand how the healthy development of the board is integral to the health of the organization. So here are some responsibilities of individual board members: to make a personal commitment to the mission of the organization, to regularly attend board and committee meetings, to disclose any conflict of interest, to donate financial resources to the organization, to participate in special events, and to work with board and staff to strive towards the goal of the organization. So here are some of the non-board responsibilities. Manage other staff than the executive director. Evaluation of other staff performance. Manage or make decisions about staff and discuss board issues with staff and or public. Now I'm going to turn it over to Carrie Ann. Hey, Carrie Ann, you're muted.
Okay, all right. So our next piece is to talk about some suggestions for good practices for your board. So the suggestions for good practices include co-governance with your ED, deciding who should be on your board, talking about terms and term limits, the officers and roles, the committees in which you should have, the frequency of your meetings, and decision-making and quorum. And many of these things should already exist in your organizational bylaws. If they don't, it can be helpful to take a look at your bylaws and see if some additions or revisions are needed. So co-governance with your executive director, I always say, is like the executive director is driving a car, is the driver, and the board is the GPS. And the reason why I say that is the board charts the course, sets the direction. So for example, if you're starting in Charlotte and you're trying to get to Asheville, you definitely don't want to head toward the ocean, right? You need to be headed in the right direction. So the board sets the course, says this is the mission, this is the direction in which the organization is traveling. However, they can't maneuver around the potholes, right? Your GPS doesn't tell you to steer in a different direction. Those kind of day-to-day operational decisions are made by the executive director. So the two have to work together for an organization to function at its best. So a little bit more about what that means. The relationship between the ED and the board chair is an interdependent one that requires regular communication and collaboration. It's helpful for the ED and the board chair or board co-chair to have a discussion about how often those meetings happen and kind of who sets the agenda, how that's set so it's beneficial for the organization, for the ED, and for the board chair. It's good to have good chemistry, good communication so that everything flows well and it's twin engines on a jet and not acting in any way in opposition to one another. It is critical that both the ED and the board understand their distinct roles. It's like the president and the Senate. It's just incredibly important to understand the differences between the two. So the board primarily governs and the staff primarily manages the organization. This means a board provides counsel to the ED and the rest of the management team, but should not be involved in the day-to-day affairs of the organization. So decisions about what general steps are taken on a day-to-day basis is not the board's purview. That's the staff and the ED. So the next question really is, how many board members does a nonprofit need? And the short answer is enough to get the job done. Every organization is a little bit different, so you need to look at the needs of your organization, the size of the organization, and what makes the most sense for you in order to advance your mission. So who should be on your board? Well, first, it's important to check your bylaws to see what information is there about the number of members and any other details about who must serve on your board. The law states a minimum of 3. That's from the IRS. but the recommended size generally depends on the size and age of the organization. Most organizations typically have about 5 to 15 board members, and it really depends on your organization and what works best for you. Second part of the question about who should be on your board is about the individual board members. So boards should reflect a range of skill sets, experience, and preferably multiple and different networks of contacts. You really want your board members to also be a benefit to the organization. So you want diversity, you want to ensure the board is representative of the community and those that your organization is trying to serve and reach. One of the questions that comes up is we have to deal with finance, we have to deal with legal issues, so do we need accountants and lawyers on the board? Well, the answer is no, you do not have to have accountants and lawyers on the board, but it is important to have some level of financial savvy. The treasurer needs to be able to present the financials to the board. So to be able to understand them in order to present them is just incredibly helpful. Analytical ability is helpful. A network of contacts is helpful. A variety of pieces around subject matter expertise are helpful, including sometimes a lawyer. A number of boards have also found it helpful to have an ED or a management team member from another nonprofit in their community on their board, provided they address any conflicts of interest. So let's talk a little bit about who should be on your board. Let's talk about the skills, experience, those kind of pieces needed for your board. So in your teams, take about 5 minutes. We'll send you to breakout rooms and make a list of the skills, experience, networks, identities, backgrounds that you feel are needed for your board, and put a plus sign next to the ones that you know you need on your board and don't have or need more of on your board. And we'll come back in about 5 minutes. All right, so let's move on to terms and term limits. So it's important to check your bylaws for information on terms and term limits. The IRS does not dictate board term length, but board service terms aren't intended to be for long periods of time. Most organizations have a term that typically spans from 1 to 5 years. It's good practice for terms to be about 2 years. Term limits are also important. It's recommended that you limit folks to 2 to 3 terms total. For example, NCCADV, we have 3-year terms and board members are limited to 2 terms, so a total of 6 years of service. So put your answers in the chat, or if you want to chime in, we'll give you an opportunity to unmute yourself. Why is it best practice to limit the number of terms and length of terms of your board members? Why is that good practice? All right, and let's move on and talk a little bit about the officers in your organization. So it is helpful and required for organizations to have a board president, or some organizations call them board chairs, or in the case of us for the coalition, we have co-chairs. A lot of organizations also, instead of a co-chair, have a vice president or a vice chair, and then a treasurer and a secretary. So the president or board chair or co-chair is responsible for overseeing the board, overseeing the executive committee, and also participating and overseeing the nominating committee meetings. They work in partnership with the ED to ensure board resolutions are carried out. They call special meetings if necessary, And they appoint all committee chairs with the ED, who also frequently recommends who serves on those committees. The president and the chair also assist the ED in preparing the agenda for board meetings, oversees the strategic planning process, works with the nominating committee to recruit new board members, acts as a spokesperson for the organization, and periodically consults with board members on their roles and assists with performance assessments. So the president and chair is really responsible for working to ensure the board stays on track. The vice president or vice chair also serves on the exec committee, carries out special assignments as requested by the president or chair, understands the responsibilities of the president, and is prepared to step in and assume those duties in the president's absence. The board secretary, again, also serves on exec. They take the minutes at the board meetings. They ensure that the board records are accurate and kept safe, including reviewing those board minutes, providing notice of the meetings and/or a committee meeting when notice is required. And your bylaws should tell you which meetings require notice and how much. The minutes of each meeting have some requirements, which include the date and location of the meeting, whether the meeting was a regular meeting or a special meeting, how the notice of the meeting was given. It's important to list the board members and others who were present at the meeting, including any guests, and including a note of any late arrivals or early departures. Part of the reason why that's important is to know who was present for any votes. To summarize in chronological order the matters that were discussed with headings for easy reference, such as approval of minutes. To state clearly any matters presented for board approval and the specific action taken by the board. Generally, the vote count doesn't need to be recorded. It's important to note specific votes against a board action, however. So whenever a director asks that their abstention or dissent be recorded, that should be recorded. Refer to any documents presented at the meeting with any significant documents attached to the minutes. So for example, if the board action includes approving a policy, that policy should be included with the minutes. And then finally, the treasurer. So the treasurer serves on the executive committee and on the finance committee. They maintain knowledge of the organization and its goals and objectives. They should have some understanding of financial accounting for nonprofit organizations, which includes some knowledge of the grants and funding sources for the organization. Start it up again. All right. The treasurer is also responsible for working with the ED to ensure that appropriate financial reports are made available to the board on a timely basis, and to present the annual budget to the board for approval, and then to review the monthly financial reports and present them to the board. So we're going to take another moment to work and think about this together. So put your answers in the chat, or feel free, we'll give you a moment to unmute yourself if you'd like, and to talk about, why do boards have committees? Why are committees important? So why should boards have committees? All right, we're going to switch over. And can you see my screen, Deanna?
Yes, I can.
Wonderful.
All right, so next we're going to talk a little bit about the committees. So you have your executive committee, your finance, fundraising, nominating, and board of governance, and then your human resources policy. You'll see there are asterisks beside finance, fundraising, and human resources, because these are committees that are required by the Council for Women and Youth Involvement, which is one of the state funders for your domestic violence and rape crisis center services. But we want to make a note here. Check with your other funders about any other requirements they may have as well. So we're going to talk about the executive committee. The executive committee meets as needed and includes the president and chair, vice president, vice chair, secretary, treasurer, and the executive director. Supervises the ED, so they hire, evaluate, support, and terminate the executive director as needed. Next is the finance committee. This committee should submit a written report at each board meeting for the entire board to review, including the balance sheet and the P&L statement, which is profit and loss. Treasurer must serve on the finance committee. Your fundraising committee plans and completes fundraising events, seeks financial support, and promotes awareness of the organization. Your nominating or board of governance committee. The president usually chairs this committee, and they nominate new board members and officers. New board member orientation and training is also a responsibility of this committee. Governance often refers to the board's activities to oversee the purpose, plans, and policies of the overall organization. So for this committee, they're establishing the overall plans or strategic planning and policies, ensuring sufficient resources, so financial and personnel for the organization, and they're ensuring compliance with rules and regulations. In terms of this strategic plan, the strategic plan should be the guide or the roadmap. There are many ways to put a strategic plan together. One of the things that we highly encourage is that staff is involved in the conversation. Your strategic plan should span a period of 3 to 5 years, and it's a working document that should be constantly reviewed and adjusted when needed. And your organization's budget should be tied to your strategic plan. Your human resources or policy committee, they ensure your organization is following laws and best practices when it comes to employment. They write and revise your HR and other organizational policies. So your required policies and procedures. All agencies are required to have a conflict of interest, confidentiality, non-discrimination, code of conduct, whistleblower, internal controls, personnel, record keeping, record retention and destruction for electronic and paper files. So we're going to place you in your teams, and we want you to spend 5 minutes talking about what committees you currently have on your board, if you think those are the right committees for your organization, and what changes do you want to make to your committees. This can be which committees you have or about how they operate. And make sure you report someone to be your reporter back. And during your report pack, we'll have at least one team share their group response.
All right, so then the next piece is to talk a bit about meeting frequency. So first, it's important to check in your bylaws about what it says about the meeting frequency for your board. Meetings typically range from occurring monthly to quarterly. It is recommended that you meet at least quarterly and that your meetings happen as often as needed to get your work done. Another piece that should be included in your bylaws is what quorum is for your board. Quorum is the minimum number of members that must be present at any meeting in order to make the proceedings of that meeting valid. When you look in your bylaws for quorum information, you'll see that it typically ranges from a simple majority, meaning half of the board plus 1, to about 2/3 of all members. But bylaws vary. You also need to make sure you know how many board members you have. So a lot of times how many members are on your board can also be dictated by trying to ensure that you have a good way to reach quorum. In decision making, if your vote is by simple majority, you need half of the members in attendance plus one. For consensus, everyone must generally agree. Some organizations choose to use five-finger voting or five-finger consensus. And normally in five-finger consensus, a 5 is completely agree, let's move forward, and a 1 is nope, don't want to move forward. And in some forms of five-finger consensus, any one vote or a 2 vote stops things from moving forward, and a 3 means we go along with the majority. And frequently there's a process, and you certainly have a lot of resources available to you, and we'd be happy to share if you're interested in more about five-finger consensus. Some organizations also do thumbs up if you're for it, to the side if you're not sure or want to have more discussion, and down if you're not interested. There's also versions of modified consensus where at least 75% of members must vote at least a 3 out of a 5, and there is no full veto. It is still that it would move forward if at least 75% of the members voted a 3 out of 5. So to go back to something we talked about earlier, this is one of the areas where, again, it becomes very important about co-governance with the executive director. So the relationship between the ED and the board, as we said, is interdependent, requires regular communication. It is critical to remember that the ED and the board members must hold on to their roles and respect those boundaries with one another. How important that chemistry is, just as a reminder, because as you're looking at the ways in which board decision making occurs and the ways in which the agenda is shared, the ED has to have the same respect for the ways in which the board makes decisions. So we're going to take a few minutes in your groups, in your teams, to talk about what are the ways in which you're effectively co-governing the organization, the board and the ED, and what are some ways in which you could improve co-governance of your organization. So we're going to take about 5 minutes. All right, great. Welcome back, everyone. So as we wrap up, what we're looking at is what are 3 to 5 things related to improving your board that you're thinking about based on today's training. So make a little to-do list for yourself. Take about 4 minutes in your team to work together to make a list of those 3 to 5 things that you will do going forward based on today's training.